Okay, I just want to let everyone know that I have started the recording, so everything that you say from this point forward will be recorded. Oops. Okay, let me just double check and make sure there aren't any more people in the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Okay. And I know some more people are going to join us. There was a conflicting session that some people thought wouldn't be over till 7:15 or 7:30. So, okay, so I just wanted to start off with a few announcements. So for those of you who don't know me, and it's nice to see so many faces and some new faces tonight too. So I'm really pleased about that. The one nice thing about being forced to meet this way is that it's getting the opportunity for some additional people to participate. So so tonight, this is our May meeting. We do hold our meetings every other month for our general membership, and they're open to the public. So I'm gonna have to pause every moment or so here when somebody needs to be admitted. So it is giving me an alert, which is the good news. So I do want to start with a few announcements before we, oops, why isn't it moving my screen forward? There we go. Okay. So just some announcements of what's going on with the club. So because of the pandemic, National Sierra Club has issued guidance that we're not allowed to hold any in-person or face-to-face meetings or outings until after June 14th. We are waiting for updated guidance on them to determine what we'll be able to do then. I know there's a big push amongst members to be able to at least do some kind of outings outdoors with appropriate physical distancing. So hopefully we'll be able to do that maybe starting mid-June before things get too hot. So we're looking forward to that. I also wanted to let everyone know that we've added a new member to the Osage Group Executive Committee, Walter Bargan, who is one of our members and lives in the Ashland area, has agreed to fill a vacancy that we had on the executive committee, and so he will be fulfilling a unexpired term that runs through year end, and then at that point he'll be up for election. And I also wanted to mention that we still have one opening, so if anyone's interested in helping out with the executive committee, we'd love to talk to you. The executive committee meets once a month, and it isn't a great deal of work, but I did want to let you know that that is something that's available. And Jan, would you keep an eye on the chat room, or Christine? I see there's some chats, and so I can check it after I go through the announcements. But in case there's anything,
I'll take a look on it.
All right, thank you. I also wanted to let you know that tonight's session is being recorded, and we also recorded our March meeting, which was also done via Zoom. And if anybody missed that and is interested, we talked about climate action and adaptation planning, specifically what is happening in Colombia, but then we also had a broader conversation about how other communities in mid-Missouri could begin to develop their own either climate action plans or just take some initial climate actions. And so the links for both of those tonight and that previous one will be on our Facebook page, which is Sierra Club Osage Group. And also, I haven't done this yet, but I will add them to our YouTube channel, which is Sierra Club Osage Group. And we'll look into adding a page on our Sierra Club Osage website for these, but we haven't done that yet. So I just wanted to mention some of our ongoing conservation work. Dee Dawkin is on the call or on our meeting tonight, and she is our conservation chair. Of course, a lot of this has been put on hold because commissions and task forces and other city and county bodies haven't been meeting. But planning and zoning is beginning to get started again for the city of Columbia in June. So one of the things that Dee has been doing is monitoring the development of the wind farm regulations that are being considered in the for Boone County. Columbia and Boone County are going to be jointly developing a plan for how to develop the area that's immediately west of Columbia city limits. And then Dee does a great job monitoring what's going on with planning and zoning activities in Columbia. But anytime you see something that you have questions or concerns about, it doesn't hurt to raise your hand and mention that to one of us. And you can always contact us at our Gmail account, which is sc.osage.group@gmail.com, or through our Facebook page. And if anybody is willing to help Dee with being a backup to attend planning and zoning commissions when Dee has a conflict, that'd be really helpful too. And then Dee also represents us in ongoing participation in the Hinkson Creek anti-pollution efforts, which is also a regional activity that's been going on for quite some time now. And I didn't list it on this chart, but we are as a group, very engaged in the climate action work in Columbia. And the city's climate commission has been on break now, and it looks like we'll be able to get our work started up again in July. So I'm looking forward to that.
Carolyn?
Yes.
This is Dee, and actually the county and city P&Z meetings are starting tomorrow again.
Okay, thanks, Dee.
But they will, at least the city one will be on video. I'm not sure about the county.
Okay, that's good. That's good to know. Yeah, because I'd seen some notices in the paper that I thought it was going to be June, but thanks for mentioning that. Okay, and then one of the key volunteer opportunities I wanted to highlight tonight, it's kind of an urgent need, is we need some people to participate in the Osage Group Political Committee. Sierra Club uses a multi-step endorsement process. So for local races, we're supposed to have a committee of members who would make recommendations to the executive committee for local races or for state legislature races for our region. And then once those recommendations are made, then the executive committee votes. So that gives us a two-step process for people who are reviewing the candidates to make sure that we're only endorsing, candidates who are really consistent with Sierra Club's mission and values. And then for the state legislature elections, there's a third level of the process, which is the chapter political committee also takes a look at those. So it's not real time consuming. We'll be meeting via Zoom or teleconference, and we really need to get some people in place so that we can start looking at endorsements probably beginning in June. And so this activity period runs generally June through October. And then right now the need, of course, is related to the endorsement process. But then if people are interested, they can continue working as we get closer to the elections. There's opportunities, of course, to work in the campaigns for the endorsed candidates. In the past, that's been door knocking and phone calling. I'm not sure what that'll look like this year. It might look like phone calling and text messaging or letter writing. I know those are some of the things National is doing in their campaign related to the president's position. So we'll be looking at those. We're also still have on the calendar a PAC fundraiser, which is planned for August 22nd. So if you haven't already got that on your calendar, please put that on your calendar. Hopefully we will get to have that. Right now it's planned for August 22nd in the evening, and that's a Saturday. And we'll be raising money for the Missouri Sierra Club Political Action Committee. And the reason that we need to do that is because we have about 1,500 members, paid members in our Sierra Club Osage group, but we have over 5,000 people who are what we call supporters. And those are people who, participate in some activity one way or another, but they haven't necessarily paid their dues or kept their dues current. They may be past members. And so in order to contact those people and tell them about our endorsed candidates and encourage them to get out to vote, we have to have PAC funds, to do mailings or phone calls, that type of thing. So that's why we'll be holding a PAC fundraiser, because we can't commingle that with our regular money. So if anybody is interested in that, you can contact us at this Gmail account or reach out to me personally. It's sc.osage.group@gmail.com. That's our general account, and you can contact us about this or any other subjects at that email address. Okay, so let me just stop for a second and see if there's any questions before we jump into today's main presentation. Is there any questions about anything I mentioned or anything else that's on your mind? You can unmute yourself in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Or you can type a question in the chat box. Okay, well, hearing no questions right now, I will go on. So I want to introduce our speaker tonight. We're really pleased to have Dr. Charles Nilon with us, who is a professor at the University of Missouri in the School of Natural Resources, particularly professor of fisheries and wildlife. And he's an expert in urban wildlife ecology and conservation, and related to the human dimensions in wildlife management. And I tell you, this is a really timely subject for me because we have a fox who has taken up residence under our front sidewalk. And she has had her young ones there. So, so the urban wildlife has come home to roost at my house. So, Dr. Nilon's research considers the role of nature in the part of an individual's day-to-day environment and the environmental justice issues associated to access to nature. And a lot of his projects that he's worked on have been in Kansas City and St. Louis. We'll be monitoring the online chat for questions or comments, and you can also unmute yourself to ask a question. So I'm going to stop sharing so that Dr. Nilon can start sharing. Oops.
Okay.
I assume you had a presentation, so.
I do. Okay. Well, first, thank you for inviting me to speak, and Christine, thank you for inviting me. And please call me Charlie, so that's, anyway.
Okay.
Thank you, but thank you again for inviting me. And what I'm going to talk tonight about is does relate to environmental justice, and it relates to some work that I've been involved with probably for the last 20 years, and specifically it relates to some work that my students and I have been doing in St. Louis and in Columbia, although we're going to talk about just the Columbia part as far as the birds and things. And we also have a fox in our yard too, so that's kind of fun. So I like foxes, and we have one I saw one for the first time in our yard ever a couple weeks ago, so that was kind of cool. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll start out. So my talk is going to be really about environmental justice in the broadest sense, but really how it relates to what I do as a wildlife biologist. And I got interested in this for a long time, but more specifically as kind of research probably about 20 years ago. And that started when some colleagues and I that worked together on a variety of projects started thinking about what are the environmental justice issues that relate to that have an ecological or conservation component, and how do we as like biologists working in those areas and wildlife people and so on, how do we kind of get involved in those kinds of research? And then also we ask that kind of flip question, how do environmental justice issues maybe inform the kinds of questions we might ask as wildlife ecologists? And part of what really led to this, it actually is linked with the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club has had an environmental justice initiative going, I know of, for almost 20 years. I'm not sure exactly how long, but they were one of the first mainstream conservation groups to really go into this area. So about in 2006 or 2007, the Ecological Society of America, which is a big kind of professional society for ecologists and wildlife people and so on, they met in Memphis, and a group of us organized a field trip with the Sierra Club to talk about what they were doing and to talk about what kinds of projects they were doing in Memphis and how ecologists might be involved. So you're looking at some people on the trip. Ms. Harris, this woman in the red blouse, And then the gentleman with the white baseball cap is a guy named Stanley Abel, and Stanley is a professor at Lemoyne College in Memphis, and is an ecologist. And one of the things that they had collaborated on was doing a program every year on ecology and environmental justice in Memphis. So Ms. Harris took us out on what she calls a toxic tour of Memphis. And so we went around to several sites where she was working as someone actually paid by the Sierra Club to run their environmental justice project in Memphis, which focused a lot on several toxic sites in Memphis. A couple areas have been severely impacted, some pretty large areas of the city. Some of the larger African-American neighbors in the city are in sites where there were a variety of Superfund sites, particularly from where this cloud sort of plume is coming from, which is an area where a company produces a precursor for pesticides. And the company's been through about 4 or 5 different owners. And since the 1920s, these different owners had things with buried drums of stuff and all kinds of things impacting this neighborhood. And by the way, Interstate Barbecue is really good barbecue, so I'll just add that in there. But what I got interested in was, what's environmental justice mean in more sort of a day-to-day setting that relates to wildlife and wildlife habitat. And I'm really interested more in thinking about what it might mean to what people experience day to day. So a good example is when we started out, Carolyn mentioned seeing foxes in her yard. So I got interested in, are the kinds of things you see in and around where you live, is there an environmental justice component to that? So that's kind of what my research is focused on, and that's what this talk's going to focus on. So we're going to start out with an example from St. Louis, and then we're going to say, of course, Columbia's not like that because we're Columbia. So I'm going to try to show how Columbia might have similar kinds of issues, and then see how that might relate to wildlife and wildlife habitat. So my talk's going to be based on a project I got involved with through several different people in St. Louis, and also that migration has been involved with. And the first half of this actually comes from a presentation I was involved with Missouri State Historical Society in Missouri. So you'll see a little bit about that. But what I'd like you to think about is work that my students and I were doing in North St. Louis. And this is the area north of Del Mar. And for those of you from St. Louis, remember St. Louis. And this is an area that if you read the paper, if you're from St. Louis and so on, you say, oh, this is a place that's dangerous. There's crime. There are lots of vacant lots. It's a place that's been abandoned, but they're also vacant. They're also forested areas, they're parks, historic buildings, they're thriving neighborhoods. So there's this real mix of kinds of places in North St. Louis. And if you think about North City, you think about it again as places that have gone through this major, major shift over the past 60 years, which really has impacted both the people and the actual sort of ecological setting of North St. Louis. So one of the things that I've been interested in, as well as other people have been interested in, is how has all this change in North St. Louis impacted birds, vegetation, all these kinds of things, mammals, people's experience with nature and all this stuff when they've had this major transition. So North St. Louis and North City is often called, they mentioned on the website, so St. Louis Patina, is that it's the most misunderstood, stereotyped, and neglected section of the city. And we'll talk about why that might be. Now, the second part of this, before we get to environmental justice, is a concept we want to introduce that is sort of linked. One's called everyday nature, and one is called popular values of nature. So the idea behind this is that if you want to think about how you might frame environmental justice issues around wildlife, you might think about this in a city as, what are people's experiences day to day with nature? And I'd argue that everyone has contact with nature every day, and you can debate about how in-depth that experience is, how meaningful it is, but everybody has that contact with nature. And then popular values of nature relate to what people ascribe to those experiences, what they feel about it, what excites them, and so on. So some background on environmental justice, and there's lots and lots of literature on this, but I'll mention a couple people as I go through this. The two people on this slide The person on top is Beverly Wright, who is at Dillard University in New Orleans, Louisiana. She's been really active in looking at how do people recover from disaster. So she's worked along the Mississippi Gulf Coast and looking at how do you engage people around recovery from Hurricane Katrina and other things going on in New Orleans. But she's looked at it from a framework of environmental justice. So she's thought about, say, how do people deal with things like the fact that their experience is different because of race and gender. They look at more of the systemic role of some of this. In other words, that some of the decisions made around environmental issues are tied to race and gender and poverty and so on, and that there have been some systemic efforts to kind of enforce certain patterns in cities. They try to understand what mechanisms might explain that, and there's also a strong activist and scholarly tradition. Other person in here is a guy named Nick Heinen, who teaches at the University of Georgia. And he's also done a lot of work on this, particularly looking at sort of local environments in cities. So he's interested in things like what kind of environments people experience as far as street trees. What do their yards look like? Those kinds of things. And then what might shape what those patterns look like across the city. So these are two people who are pretty current people working on environmental justice kinds of questions. I think Dr. Wright's a lot more of an activist and really engaged in kind of community transformation. And then Nick Heinen is more, probably a little more scholarly and more academic. Okay, as far as everyday nature, the idea and how this might tie in environmental justice comes from several people, but two of the people really involved in this were Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, who were both professors at University of Michigan. They're environmental psychologists, and they did a lot of their work in the 70s and 80s. And they came up with this idea that what shapes people's experience of nature is what's within a mile of where they live, work, and so on. So the places they encounter every day, when they're outside, when they're working in their yard, when they're playing with their kids, walking their dog, all the things everybody does day to day. And that environment is a physical environment, and it's linked to things like preference and fear. And it's also relevant to how people manage their yards, their property, how they kind of manage that experience. So this is some of the kind of background in terms of how I'm interested in these questions. And then I'm going to think about them as being a wildlife biologist, interested in things like birds and vegetation and mammals and their interactions in cities. So some of the key ideas about all this are that if you think about nature and city, it's shaped by bottom-up decisions that residents make. So for example, every single one of us makes a decision to some extent about what nature around them looks like. We cut our lawn or we don't cut our lawn. We have native species or we don't. We have bird feeders. We do all these different things to shape what nature looks like around us. And some of that is done as a result of a legacy. In other words, you buy a house or you rent a property, you're living there, and you deal with what's there. Some of it is about your ability to manage the place, your income, your age, the resources you have, the skills you have, and so on. And some's about your perception. In other words, what you perceive to be a nice place, what's desirable, what species do you like, those kinds of things. Then there's also a top-down process that relates to all kinds of processes. It relates to planning, to zoning, to all the things you talked about at the start of the meeting. And then there are things like restrictive covenants and segregation and all these sort of informal ways that either governments or more sort of power interests in cities shape what happens. So these are things that kind of shape nature. And again, I'm interested if there's an environmental justice kind of side to that. So some of the people looking at popular values of nature, these are just some people who sort of are really active in this, and these folks are not from the US, but the two people on top are Jacqueline Burgess and Carolyn Harrison, and they worked over in England with a lot of these kinds of concepts. And the people on the bottom are Emily Muritet and Teddy Reefer in France, and they've looked a lot at all these questions about sort of some of the social justice aspects of nature and how people experience nature and how sort of people deal with all these different issues around what kind of nature they're exposed to and how they manage it and so on. But some real important things on this are that when you think about nature in cities, you could think about the kind of values people assign. For example, you might say they're elite values in some sense, like you could argue that when we say elite, we don't mean it so much in terms of like you talk about elites in more political sense. It means elite this time more like people have information based more on knowledge. So they might value something because they know a lot about it. People talk about those elite values and popular values being important. They talk about enjoying contact with nature. People talk about the social aspects of nature. That is, people socialize, and I think the last 2 months we kind of see that there's a social aspect of nature. There's sort of this idea of people being outside to have contact with nature that's really important. Then also there's a whole issue around kind of the darker sides of nature. People have risk and fears and safety, and they don't want to be certain places. And again, the events of kind of the last 2 months illustrate that. The outside places are thought to be really attractive. People want to go there, but there's also fears associated with them. There are fears about crowding. So all these things are popular values of nature. So how this relates to wildlife is all these things are going to shape how people experience nature, how they manage it, how they work with it, what they want to see in the city, and so on. Okay, so one of the things though that I was interested in looking at in St. Louis and in Columbia is how do all of these different things around environmental justice and popular values, how are they actually operationalized? How do they work in the city? What kind of does it? So one of the things that I've worked on a little bit trying to understand along with other people is what role do all of these things on the slide play? In other words, residents, we talked about, make decisions every day about nature in the city. Local governments do. But then we got into thinking about how do things like real estate associations, federal policy, banks, all the different kinds of city ordinances, zoning, covenant practice, real estate practice, mortgage insurance, all these things. How do they shape what the city looks like? And then in terms, how do those things shape wildlife and wildlife habitat? So what I'm trying to do here is just say there's going to be a link between kind of people and the values they have, and then the way they carry out, how they manage land, how they manage property. And those two things are going to do a lot to shape what kind of animals you see in the city. So the question that I'm looking at in St. Louis and in Columbia, so you can substitute St. Louis and Columbia here, are what created the current pattern of sort of habitats for wildlife in North St. Louis, and what created that current pattern. And then I'm also interested in, well, what's that mean for different species, and what's that mean in terms of wildlife management and conservation. So one of the things that shows up when you study St. Louis and also when you study St. Columbia is that St. Louis in some ways has been, for the last 100 years or so, there's a lot of literature around this we could talk about later on, but talks about that St. Louis as being kind of a test case for both the really bad things around race in cities and some of the really positive things. And we'll get into that. So, but what kind of drove this in St. Louis and partially in Columbia was that St. Louis, because of its location, because of its history, particularly after World War I, where they had a lot of people moving from the South into St. Louis, became almost like a test case for how cities try to deal with a rapidly increasing African American population. So one of the things with St. Louis happened was that St. Louis really has had to wrestle continuously with the issue of where Black people live and where white people live in the city and how to deal with that. And so to start out, if you looked at St. Louis, say after World War I, the dots represent where Black residents lived in St. Louis. And as you look at this map, the first thing to notice is that St. Louis flipped around so that the Mississippi River is on the bottom, and it took me a while to figure that out looking at the map. but the map is reversed. So they show, and the north arrow also is pointing the wrong way. But if you look at this map, they're showing the city of St. Louis with the river on the bottom, and these dots represent 100 Black residents. And what you see is that in 1934, when this map was made, that the Black population of St. Louis was concentrated in the center, north central part of the city, but not where it is now. So to give you a little orientation, this obviously is the river down here. So this would be where the arch is, about right in here. This is Fairgrounds Park. This is Calvary Cemetery and Bell Fountain Cemetery. This is O'Fallon Park. So I-70 would be coming in now from the upper part of the picture and turning to the left as you get close to downtown, just to kind of orient you. So where the Black community was situated would have been pretty much just to the north and to the south of Highway 64, Highway 40, going through St. Louis. Okay. And one of the first things that happened in St. Louis was again going to shape how St. Louis looks and how open spaces are and green spaces in St. Louis came in 1916, when St. Louis became one of the first cities to actually try to have legal segregation. So in 1916, St. Louis passed a referendum to adopt segregation, which would restrict people moving onto blocks in St. Louis. So in St. Louis, Black people couldn't move in to a block that had more than 75% white residents, and white residents couldn't move in the block that had more than 75% Black residents, and so on. So it was trying to restrict where people could move legally, and then to enforce this pattern of segregation. So the idea was to restrict again where people lived. So you see first on here the St. Louis Argus, which is a Black paper in St. Louis, and then on the right you see a leaflet that was put up by people kind of advocating segregation. And this actual ordinance was passed, and then it was defeated the next year, or I'm sorry, it was overturned by the Supreme Court the next year, which outlawed it. So the next step, again, to kind of enforce where people lived in St. Louis, was this idea of restrictive covenants. And again, if you look at the map, it's the same orientation, but they're showing where there are restrictive covenants, which would say, again, who you could sell your house to. So what these were subdivision ordinances that were, or subdivisions when they started selling lots where houses would put a covenant in the deed saying you could not sell your home or your property to Black people, Jewish people, a whole range of people that they were trying to keep out of the neighborhood. So again, the idea on this, as you look at this map, is showing Forest Park at the top, O'Fallon Park, Bell Fountain Cemetery, and Calvary Cemetery on the right-hand side of the picture, and so on. And it's showing how these were put in place. So if you look at these, and particularly along Natural Bridge and some other places, a lot of the literature about this says that what the covenants were designed to do were to kind of box in where people live. So they were designed to box in the Jewish community, designed to box in the Black community, and so on, and keep people from being able to move out of a certain neighborhood. So it's designed, again, to keep people kind of in a certain focus. And restrictive covenants made it through about the 1940s. So the big case, Shelley versus Kramer, was actually nationally the big case outlawing restrictive covenants in the 1940s. And this is a St. Louis case. So again, the idea that some of the people who write about this talk about is that St. Louis has been a case where they've had these really major court cases overturning segregation, overturning restrictive covenants in St. Louis, and this has all been happening in St. Louis. So this sort of history of kind of activism and all this stuff has been going on for a while. But this case shows actually the house that was the property that was in the case, and it shows one of the plaintiffs in the case. Now, the other thing going on, though, that has a more recent and probably ongoing focus and is more relevant to Columbia a little bit, are some additional things going on. There were a variety of federal policies which also shaped where people lived and shaped sort of what land looks like. So to kind of backtrack a little bit, what segregation and restrictive covenants did was to tend to restrict where people lived in St. Louis. It restricted some of people's ability to buy and sell property. And it meant that, and that's going to have a big impact, as we'll see in a little bit. Now, the next three things that are on here were all federal policies relating to home ownership and how cities were being managed, and land and cities were being managed. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation came out of the New Deal, and it was exactly what it says. It was it's a federal loan program for homeowners. One of the things this did is shown on this map. So this map shows colors, and the colors relate to the ability of people to get loans. So basically anything that is red or yellow means that the folks who produced the map for this agency felt that these were places that were going to be the most risky loans. So everything in red and yellow were riskier loans. The blues and greens were more favorable terms for getting loans. So as you see in here, the sort of wealthier parts of the city, out in this case in the map, they show University City and parts of Clayton and some other places were considered pretty good investments for lending, and whereas the more inner city parts of the city were not. So again, this shaped a couple things. One, if you look in here where most of the Black community, the lower income communities in St. Louis were, people couldn't get loans and for properties. So again, this tends to have an impact that it makes it harder for people to maintain properties. People can't buy. So again, it kind of is going to lead to some things like deterioration of some of the neighborhoods. And when you hear the term redlining, a lot of this comes out of some of the stuff in this period. The next thing, which will again tied together, would be again urban renewal and public housing. So on the left, it shows the mayor of St. Louis in the 1950s looking at Mill Creek Valley, which would again be where the Chavez Center is, by SLU, where Harris Stowe State University is. And this would be just north of Interstate 64, Highway 40 in St. Louis to about just north of Forest Park and around the hospitals and up there. And then the picture to the right shows sort of this whole area during the height of urban renewal. So this was clearly a program that was needed. It was to address substandard housing and so on. What happened with this was it tended to displace a lot of Black residents, and it started really a push, which started leading toward white flight in North St. Louis, which again was still a predominantly white neighborhood. It led to a lot of displacement of people. It led to building of public housing and the Pruitt-Igoe project and a whole range of things. So this sort of set off a whole series of events in St. Louis that really started changing North City a lot. It started the movement of first middle-class white residents out of the neighborhood, and then it continued into the 80s with middle-class Black residents leaving. So it had a real impact on kind of displacing people from St. Louis City out into the county. And again, they mentioned Pruitt-Igoe Homes, which was a big public housing project up in St. Louis, which started out being very popular, but resulted again in continuing kind of this process of land abandonment, people moving and so on. So what I'm using this just to set up was that if you think about what happened in St. Louis and the idea of saying that sort of policy and a whole range of factors which essentially discriminated against different groups of people, particularly low-income Black residents, shaped a lot of the pattern of land use now in the city. So if you think about North City as having lots of vacant areas, lots of abandoned properties, abandoned buildings, and so on, which now forms this sort of really large area of green space, that was created through a series of policies. Now, Columbia's a different kind of city. It's a smaller city and has a very different history, sort of social history. But one of the things that I got interested in, along several other colleagues, particularly Robin Rotman, who's a colleague in natural resources, that we've been interested in has been looking at Columbia from kind of an environmental justice framework. So I had a graduate named Eric Fischel who worked on this project excuse me, with me, with me, and it was his research project. And we're going to talk about this a little bit. We're going to get some background first. So if you think about Columbia, this is a map that was in a thesis done at University of Missouri in the 1990s. And what this map shows is where the Black community in Columbia was in the 1930s. And if you look on the map, you see that Black community was kind of focused on a couple different areas. It was in an area over where Log Brew Pub is now, just east of Columbia College on the railroad tracks. And then it was in an area, sort of 3 areas near downtown, Cemetery, which was where Lucky's used to be, and where Osco's was, and where Schnucks used to be. So that sort of shopping center by Office Depot. The area, the sort of West End, which would be now where parts of the Blind Boon homes are, and some of the other public housing just to the north and west of downtown. And then Sharp End, and Sharp End was primarily a business district, not as residential. So this was sort of where the Black community was in Columbia in the 1930s. And one of the things in the 1935 city plan, again as a city policy, talked about Douglas School, and which is now Douglas High School. And what they mentioned in here is kind of interesting, because they talk about plans in this 1935 city plan for schools and where schools should go. And in the statement around schools, they talk about Douglas School, and it says that it's well located to serve the population, again, the Black population, because Columbia has segregated schools. And then it said that a site that the city was considering on McBain, which is about maybe 5 or 6 blocks west of there, was on the west of the area, now occupied by Negroes, and there's no reason for this district to expand. So again, even in Columbia, that city policy is saying, okay, we want to keep people in certain places. And so they talked about not expanding, or to expand Douglas School and provide more recreation and so on in the center of the city. Columbia also had restrictive covenants. Rachel Breckus over in Ellis Library has done research on restrictive covenants in Columbia. And she found, again, she has some language in here for some of these. For example, one covenant says that none of said lots shall be sold or rented to anyone other than a member of the white race. Others say, so they have the standard language at first that talks about the covenants, which is in everybody's deed. Then they have this part at the bottom about race. And to give you an idea of one of these places, if you look on the website that Rachel's developed, they show a place called Alamo Place Subdivision, which is off of Worley. It's on the north side of Worley. And in Clarksdale, so it's over by where now it'll be just to the north of where West Middle School is. And as you look on here, again, this was one of these places that had restricted covenants. So if you think about the location, again, this would be just west of the area that the city plan talks about. So again, the idea of restricted covenants to kind of shape where people live, that was in place. And a thing to think about now is that at least parts of this neighborhood now will be an area that at least on Worley Street and some of the surrounding streets would have been considered more probably where more of the Black community in Columbia now is. So what happened in Columbia after this, again, they had urban renewal. And so an urban renewal went on in Columbia with this idea of changing what the city looked like, trying to improve housing, a variety of things. And in Columbia, the city took advantage starting in 1956 of some both federal legislation in 1949 and the state's response to that. And they set up something called a Land Clearance for Redevelopment Authority, which is under Missouri state law that gives local governments the power to set these up to do essentially urban renewal programs and to do that. And they were initially designed to be a slum clearance program, which would give cities federal money for that, but that sort of had expanded. Missouri kind of expanded that to focus on redevelopment and other kinds of activities. So starting in 1958, the city started the Douglas School Urban Renewal Area, which basically went from about 10th, where the post office is, west over to about Clinkscales, and then north to just south of Pickman, and then down towards Cemetery Hill. And this is the start of the urban renewal process. And as a result of this, about 279 houses were torn down. And again, this resulted in a lot of displacement people throughout the city, and it sort of started the process of changing where Black people lived in Columbia and so on. And again, there's some pictures that the city had of some of this process going on and in the city. So you might wonder, how does all this fit into trying to understand birds? So one of the things that Eric was interested in and that we worked on in this project was this idea first of what kind of species do people are in neighborhoods in the city, what kind of bird species are there, and how might these differences be associated with things about race, income, level of education, home ownership. And we recognized, of course, that Columbia is a very different city than it was in the 1950s, that where people live has changed, but we were interested in trying to understand if sort of some of this more systemic factors that might have impacted people in Columbia, if that's had any impact on the kinds of environments around people's houses, the sort of everyday environments they encounter, and so on. So what we did was we started out by doing an analysis of the city, and this is something called social areas analysis, which basically is just a kind of statistical procedure for looking at a lot of different kinds of data about neighborhoods. And so what we did was we used census tract block groups, which are subdivisions of census tracts in cities, and there's 63 in Columbia. And what we did was we did an analysis of these using a lot of census data about things like income, poverty status, home ownership, age of housing, level of education. We used race, gender, and so on. And so we used to allow the census data to do this. And we came out with sort of a map that shows sort of Columbia in terms of different types of neighborhoods, or different types of block groups, kind of like neighborhoods based on this. And the red dots represent how we did our sampling to try to count birds. So we did these bird counts in these areas with this idea of saying, could we see if there are differences in birds and bird habitat around the city that might be tied to some kind of legacy of segregation, people moving around, poverty, and so on. So basically, the areas we looked at, the blue area, primarily Northeast Columbia, lots of Northeast Columbia, the east side of Columbia, are newer neighborhoods. They tend to be slightly lower income. They have more rental property and so on. So the way of thinking about this is, if you go out, I would say rangeline, and think about the area around Blue Ridge School and so on. These are typical of a lot of these neighborhoods. The area in green, again, are areas that have many more Black residents. They tend to also be lower income neighborhoods. They actually have a mix of probably more owner occupied housing in the southern areas and more rental areas in the northern part of the city. Another thing that characterizes these are that these are neighborhoods that have where residents have significantly less education than the rest of the city, and so on. The area in pink is Southwest Columbia, which again, the wealthier areas of the city, higher income, more single family homes, residents with better education, and so on. And then the areas in tan are, again, where there are lots of renters, fewer single family homes. A lot of these be places like on Bearfield Road, a lot of places that rent to students and so on. So these kind of characterize these different places in the city based on these socioeconomic characteristics. And so this is Eric. And again, these red areas are the places where we did bird counts. And it turned out that we had 25 sites in each of the in each of the 4 different social areas. So the idea was to have a stratified group of places we looked at based on income and race and level of education and so on. So within each of these sites, we went to. They were a 1 hectare site. They're 100 meters on the side. And we did counts along, we walked the street and did bird counts. We looked at vegetation in people's front yards. That's what the digital line sampling is. That's vegetation in people's front yards. We used basically aerial photos to kind of measure the amount of different kinds of land cover in each of these. We got permission from residents to do vegetation surveys in their backyard. We also did a survey of these same residents about their land management practices. So we had 100 locations where we had data about birds and this front yard vegetation and the land cover, and we had about probably a couple 100 yards where we had data on people's backyards. So we had, out of about the 1,000 or so lots that people we could have gotten permission from, we had about 200 that agreed to let us look at their yards. So in terms of birds, we said we found about 100 species in the city of Columbia. This picture shows some of the more common ones. We saw a lot of different species, but again, it's a city. It's fairly typical. These are typical residential neighborhoods. So the birds you're seeing here, we saw a lot of, and then many other species we saw in different places around the city, but we saw fewer of those species. One of the things that characterized this, we compared this to different social areas. There was a lot of variation, as you'd expect. That's because we looked at, the areas we looked at had probably a total of about 1,000 individual yards. And obviously these yards differ in how people manage their yard. They differ in size, they differ in the vegetation that's there and so on. So there's a lot of variation. But one thing we found that they did differ in, these sites differed in, were in the sort of proportion of different kinds of species. So grassland birds, where we saw a lot of non-native birds, in this case primarily starlings and house sparrows, and then where we saw woodland species. So if you think about Columbia, we tend to see the grassland birds more in the northern part of the city, the non-native birds kind of scattered around, and then the woodland species more in the southwest. Now, as we start thinking about individual species where we could actually see differences among social areas, we saw, so I'm showing you 2 of these and I'm showing you another species just for kind of comparison. And for the more statistically inclined people, I'm just showing the averages. I didn't show all the other standard deviations and measures and all that, but essentially everything in red means there's a difference between the different social areas. So for example, the barn swallows, which again are pretty typical species you see around grass, some of the grass areas in the north, the places that were in social area 2 had fewer grassland species than the other neighborhoods. Now, social area 3, which is the southwest Columbia, doesn't have probably as many of those habitats. But what's interesting is that social area 2, again, which are the more lower income, typical African American residents and so on, had fewer of that particular species, which would be one that was pretty characteristic of a lot of the other neighborhoods in that part of the city. If you look at things like starlings, which are again a non-native species, again they were most abundant again in social area 2, which is predominantly which has more African American residents, lower income residents, and so on, and they were least abundant in southwest Columbia. Now, again, some of these differences are due to habitat, they're due to those kinds of things, but these patterns we thought were interesting that they do show up these differences show up for different species. Okay, and so what we found as we looked at some of the vegetation was that if you look just at kind of what covers people's yards, that if you look at social area 2, which is the one we've talked about several times, that there's more paved surface, there's a lot of lawn in those areas, and there are fewer trees. And there weren't differences in trees and shrubs, or in species of trees and shrubs. So what this kind of says, though, is that a lot of the areas which you might think of as being maybe poorer neighborhoods, also tend to be neighborhoods where they have a lot more lawn, a lot more ground, a lot more pavement, and so on. And again, so that question might be, why is that? What's going on there, and so on? And that may be influenced by what kind of birds people see. And we also found that across the city, backyards, different front yards, backyards have more native species. But we found that, again, backyards, there were no differences based on social area. And this kind of reinforced what people see in other cities, that your yard's very individual and yards differ from yard to yard. So there's some broad patterns, but they tend to differ from yard to yard. So as we talk about what all this means, what we found was first that where you live in Columbia matters, and that where you live to some extent is shaped by things, or is at least associated with things like race, level of income, patterns of home ownership, all these kinds of things shape where people live in Columbia. And so there's a difference between neighborhoods that are in green and neighborhoods that are in pink. And the green tend to be a little poorer. They tend to have more Black residents. They tend to have lower income, less well-educated residents. So, and then the pink areas tend to be wealthier. They have more white residents. They have better educated residents and so on. So these neighborhoods tend to be different. And to some extent, at least, people are seeing different kinds of nature around their house and around where they live. So that question is this an environmental justice case? Is it something where you say, gee, there's an issue, there's a problem? And so, which is obviously a different question. That gets into questions about how do you engage people around this issue? Is this something that people care about? Is this a policy issue? Is this an activism issue? So all these kinds of things obviously are things that we don't address in the study. We didn't address looking at this. And I think Eric and I have talked about this a lot. And we said, hey, is this a case where we should say, gee, this is a case saying that we know there's an association between a lot of these sort of socioeconomic and demographic characteristics about people and what they see in their neighborhood. But is this really an environmental justice case? So that's something that I'd be glad to discuss. Thank you for your attention so far, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Charlie, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. It's so informative. I've also lived in St. Louis, so it was really interesting to see some of the historical background there, which obviously was before my time. I'll kick us off with a question while people are thinking. One of the things I was really interested to see in your research is I work a lot on the climate action plan here in Columbia, and we've been, one of the things we're concerned about, of course, is that there's sufficient trees throughout the city. And so I was pleased to see, at least to the extent that your survey had been conducted, that in terms of trees and shrubbery, there wasn't that much difference in the social areas throughout the city. So one question I have, though, as I was thinking about what you were talking about, is you look primarily at yards. And one of the things we're concerned about with the climate action plan is also the amount of green space in the various regions. So did you factor that into your analysis at all, as how much green space there was versus, actual developed property and like a park versus not? And did that have an impact?
We did a little bit because our study areas were these kind of 1 hectare blocks. We didn't get into that as much. It picks up some. I mean, one reason why, like, I think some of the differences show up. There probably are fewer. There probably, if you look outside the lots, there probably are fewer trees, because I'll give an example, like some of the points I know about. For example, we have some points over off of Forest and some of the streets just west of Hickman, and I think there, again, there are a lot of street trees, but you go a block either side, and it's almost all paved and almost all developed. So I think there are some differences there. And so, but the way we looked at this really didn't account for that.
All right, does anyone have a question? You can either unmute your microphone in the lower left-hand corner, or you can type it into the chat box. Christine, do you have a question or comment? You're not unmuted, Christine. There you go.
Well, the map of Columbia, proves something I heard a long time ago about higher, wealthier people, or the premium place to live in any community is upwind. And so I don't know if it's all over the United States, but our predominant wind comes from the southwest.
Mhm.
And so the wealthier of us live in the southwest part of town. So we're all upwind of whatever, the traffic pollution and everything. And your map just, it's glaring right there in the map. And I think St. Louis, at one point anyway, didn't people all, in the white migration, didn't they all move, the whites, the wealthier people anyway, moved to the southwest part of town? And I guess that's in Kansas. I mean, is that a secret, or
Yeah.
is this commonly known?
That's a good question. And I'll say, I don't know. I mean, I think, the little bit I know about St. Louis, and I'll say that a lot of what I got this from St. Louis, Andrew Hurley, who teaches at UMSL, has done a lot of stuff on environmental history in St. Louis. And there are a couple other people who've written a lot about more of the segregation and some of this kind of stuff, who know more about it. But I know what Andrew said, a lot of the people in North St. Louis, so North St. Louis people went to, they just kept going north. So places, so Florissant and all the places kind of North County were where a lot of people first went. And there've been kind of waves of people. So I think a lot of the response in St. Louis was more to the north. I'm sure there's a lot of, and again, I'm not from St. Louis, so I can't speak to a lot of that. But I think there are some differences. I mean, one thing I think in Columbia is kind of interesting, and I think this relates to Carolyn's question. I think if you think about green space and you think about tree cover, I mean, one thing I know is the way we looked at yards, we looked at percent tree cover. We didn't look at size of trees, we looked at presence of trees. So I think if you look at size of trees, clearly there's a difference between Southwest Columbia and the northern part of the city. Because the trees in the northern part of the city are up, like in Blue Ridge and all that are, they're new trees, new subdivision, newer trees. In Southwest Columbia, for the most part, they're often older trees. It's often existing vegetation that they kind of built around and so on. So there's some differences there, I'm sure. But, to get your question, I think there is probably some intentionality in where people move and sort of what people have access to. And I would guess that they probably do look for places that are more attractive. I mean, I think that Southwest Columbia has trees, it's hilly, it's a very different kind of environment than the northern part of Columbia is. So I think there are some differences there.
I've got a quick question. I have noticed, well, first of all, we're on the east side of Columbia.
Mhm.
And when we moved into our house, we immediately got rid of all the lawn, planted trees, understory trees, have a rain garden in the back, and we're just trying to not mow. But we do have, and we planted all native species. We planted 65 trees in our yard, in our backyard. And we have tons of birds, like all over the place.
Mhm.
And to me, a lot of the trees that we got for free from conservation. We did put in one kind of big expensive tree. It costs money to do something like that. It was a stretch for us to do it.
Yeah.
But one thing I have noticed in a lot of the newer subdivisions going in, even in the southwest area, those, and they're like really expensive homes going in, and the new owners don't appear to really care about trees. There's no, I mean, you just don't see very many large trees even getting planted or anything. Is that a trend?
Well, one thing we did, which I didn't talk about, one that Eric did was he did a survey where he had a questionnaire. He asked everybody who had a lot that was inside those blocks was in a survey, and we got back about like 25% of them were returned. And we asked them about all kinds of things, what they do in their yard, tree planting, do they use native species? And it was interesting that, you know, people talked about, and we didn't ask specifically about do they want trees, those kind of things, but we asked her about what they value, and trees were a big part of that. People said they like trees and shrubs, those kind of things. So one thing though that we tried to look at, which was really hard to do, we tried to figure out was there how well those things matched up what people actually had in their yard. And we could kind of do that for, I think it's like about I can remember 80 something yards. They match up that way where we could look at it. And it's kind of all, it's very, very individual. I think, you know, that it's very individual. And we, you know, we found some, we looked at a couple hundred yards. We looked at, you know, what Eric said, and I went out with him some, and, you know, there's everything. We had people who had completely native yards. They had people who had paved over backyards. So I think it's very individual. On the other hand, having said that, I think that subdivisions make a lot of pretty conscious choices. And so I think like what developers do, I'm looking like right across where we live is there's a new place called Richfield Park, which is going in, which is at the bottom of Richfield Drive and College Park, right along County House Branch Trail. And that one, they are planting trees. They've done a lot of stuff, and they put trees in there, but they're tiny, tiny trees. So I think some of this gets into, you know, what the city requires. And like on this site had been cleared off to be school site for Columbia Lutheran School like 40 years ago, and they never built it. So it's been open for a long time. But other places, I think it varies with what sort of developers can convince the city they want to do.
Do you think,
yeah.
have you, I just notice these things when I'm driving around that, oh, that's a great big new subdivision. Where's all the trees? And that makes me wonder if there is something in the covenants that says you can't have, you know, trees larger than a certain height.
Yeah.
Too close to your house or something, or if there's something that's making this happen.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had a chance to look at any of those?
What I know more about, so I think there are a couple things. One is I know that when they go, so like I have my class go to the planning and zoning hearing,
Yeah.
and from what I understand, and we've talked a while ago, my classes had a gentleman who used to be one of the city foresters came, because the city forester of Public Works came, and he explained the tree preservation ordinance. And one of the things he said is that the city has a fairly strict ordinance about what developers are supposed to do. But he said that the only way they can enforce it is they have essentially a performance bond. And it's only like $250 or what, I don't know if it still is or not. I mean, basically.
Yeah, I've heard this. I was actually on the Environment and Energy Committee or Commission for a while, and that was a big thing, that there were strict rules, but they were just not enforceable in a practical sense.
Yeah, and I remember what Keith said was that there's only one person who's supposed to do it, who comes out to do, you know, the inspections and all that. And he said that a lot of the developers, I think, felt that it was either, I think, what he said in my class several years back was that even some developers who want to do the right thing, that by the time they go through and do all the stuff and mark the trees and do all the things they're supposed to do, and then the city can't come out and inspect it. So a lot of people just forget, I'll pay the $250 and just, you know, and just cut down everything. So, but I do know they have some, at least on paper, there's some pretty strict rules. There's actually the American Planning Association, a lot of the kind of codes that developers use, a lot of the guidelines they use. So if it was a good developer and a good company doing it, and they have money to do it, they have a lot of information about that. I mean, you can look up all kinds of stuff about how to maintain trees and how to do all this. So I think that
Mhm.
I think to me, I think it's probably it's more economic. I think if people feel they can sell houses with trees, they'll put them in, and if they feel they're
Yeah.
not, if they feel they're not going to make enough money, they cut them down. Because I think that there's all kinds of information you can get. You can download stuff off the web. There's American Planning Association and the home builders. So all these people have all kinds of stuff
Yeah.
on the web about how to maintain trees and do all that. So I'm guessing that probably a lot more economics. And
Yeah.
you may know more about what happened to the city. I mean, the impression I had with planning and zoning was that by the time stuff gets to the city staff, or by the time stuff gets to planning and zoning, it's already happened. Because it's the city
Right.
staff, and they can't really do anything about it. So
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
sure. One thing I will mention that since you mentioned the climate action team, the actual project that Eric had was funded through a grant. MU had a grant that was just finishing the spring, and it's called EPSCOR, which was a grant looking at ways of mitigating around climate change, and it was a $20 million grant that involved like 10 different universities around the state and lots of faculty. And part of what Eric was looking at was ways of looking at, or part of his project was looking at ways of trying to engage local residents around issues around climate change. And so one way we thought was, you're talking about how you manage your yard, if you have native species, if you have trees, that kind of thing. And so we met with Danielle Fox for the city and with Barbara Buffalo of the city about how some of the data we have might be useful to them about what vegetation was, what's native, what's not native, that kind of stuff. And so we shared that with them, and we actually have data about percent native vegetation and what the dominant species are in all these lots, and that not at the lot level, but also just at the sort of the block level. So we have that
What's the percentage of Asian honeysuckle?
That was for kind of interesting. Like we said, backyards had more native species than front yards. Kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Honeysuckle was actually, there's a lot more honeysuckle in backyards than in front yards, which kind of makes
Right.
sense. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of honeysuckle, but for trees, almost all the trees are native. I mean, there's like things like cavalry pear and that kind of stuff, but most of the tree species were native, or at least they were native as part of they're horticultural varieties of natives, so they're mostly native species. The shrubs weren't, and then there's very little sort of native vegetation as far as understory, like not much prairie, not much grass, that kind of stuff.
You just don't see native shrubs for sale anywhere. Yeah.
And that's one thing. Eric said that a lot of people, when he was out during the surveys in people's yards, he said that the people people were home and he was talking to them, that that a lot of people said that it was hard to figure that out, and also that there with some of the native, even with the native shrubs, some of what nurseries sell, if it's truly native or not, it's probably really hard to tell in some things, because they're real close to the natives, and non-natives are pretty closely related, and they're cultivars and all this other stuff. So that's hard.
Just on that point, if anybody is looking for native shrubs, I know the Missouri Wildflower Nursery out of Jefferson City sells them, because I was just looking at their catalog. So.
In Brazito?
No, and well, it's just south of Jefferson City. I don't know if it has a different name on it or not.
Yeah.
But you can order remotely too. They have a website, so, and they'll ship things. I'm getting some seeds. So. Well, are there any policy recommendations that have come out of your work, or policies that you think are appropriate, whether it's related like to the climate change mitigation, or just promoting equitable access to nature?
Well, one thing Barbara Buffalo is real interested in doing, and this kind of got started and didn't, but she said that when they've been doing the strategic what is it, the neighborhood conservation strategy. You heard about the neighborhood planning initiatives, whatever. They have a north, south, central, all up the neighborhoods.
Right. The
Well,
strategic neighborhoods. Yeah.
Yeah, right. With the strategic neighborhoods, that they were interested in trying to take some of this and incorporate that into some of the workshops they did, because they said that they had a lot of, one of the comments that came back from a lot of those were that people in the neighborhoods said that they felt the city does so much code enforcement and they're so strict on stuff that they wanted, that a lot of the residents wanted something that was maybe more positive, more proactive. So they're really interested in more of the wildlife kinds of things that people could do. And a couple things we've tried to do that we talked some with Barbara about. We're making things available, like there's a as you all know, there's a lot of material about how to do native plants in your yard, at least how to cut down on non-natives, how to use less grass, how to actually manage grass, how to manage your yard maybe a little more efficiently, so you don't have to mow as much, use those kinds of things. So we've tried to share that, and one person, many of you know Nadia Navrati Tyndall.
Yes, she was actually scheduled to speak to us in March, and then she wanted to wait till we could be in person again.
Sure, I understand. Yeah, so part of what she's doing at Lincoln with native plants, she was involved with the EPSCOR project too, and she's done a lot of stuff with yards, like what she's done here, especially down the Boot Heel. She's done a lot down in Scott County through Lincoln Extension, and they've done a lot. And I know she's talked some to Barbara about that. I mean, if you've seen her yard and you've seen some others, I mean, they've really done some really interesting stuff with native plants in yards, and she's talked about the sort of economic advantage of doing that, and the ones in the Boot Heel are low-income neighborhoods, and she's talked about okay, that you can grow fruit trees, you can do a lot of things like that. Another person who just came to interview, Sarah Lovell, who's in forestry, has done similar kind of work up in Chicago, and she just came. She's new agroforestry faculty center director, and she's done a lot of work in Chicago with low-income neighborhoods and agroforestry projects is sort of where they have community gardens, but also growing trees. People are growing fruit trees, and they've done energy plantations and a lot of different kinds of things, which might relate to climate action. And she's interested in that.
One of the things that we've got in our climate action plan for this city is, to try and promote more, urban agriculture. And I'm hoping that, with the challenges that the pandemic has caused in the food supply lines, that people will understand, why that is an important part of the climate action plan. So it would be interesting to follow up with her. Her name was Sarah Lovell.
Sarah Lovell, Lovell.
Okay.
Yeah, and she's.
I'd like to.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'd like to just point out that when Caldwell has made a comment in the chat, she says Columbia has public parks throughout the city, so should have more wildlife visible than the average town. Also walking paths and nature areas donated by individuals and groups.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I would definitely think I've lived a lot of places, and I see more wildlife, I think, in Columbia than many.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Columbia, I think has made a real effort with parks to at least kind of have some more natural areas or more natural parks. And I know they struggle a lot with things like honeysuckle and invasives and all that, but I think they've made an effort to try to do that. And I think I think one thing I know of the city, and I think with parks especially, they really struggle because they have, two people who do the natural areas, it's 2 or 3 people who do all of that for all the parks. So all the, and they spend a lot of time just, cutting trees or overhanging trails and that kind of stuff, and probably less time doing a lot of the things that might relate to more natural kinds of management of things.
Right.
Out
at Twin Lakes Dog Park, there is a beaver has taken up residence. And it was cutting down all the trees along the lake, which we very much value in the summertime for the shade. Mm-hmm. And so I called the city's forester and said, well, this beaver is really working hard, and there's not
Yeah.
going to be trees left if somebody doesn't get out there really soon.
I think there've been a couple. There may be a couple over on the side when you come in off of Chapel Hill,
Hmm.
because I come in that way sometime, and it looks like there's something going on back there because there's a lot more. It's been wet, but there's something going on back there because there's some trees that look like they just came down, and so I don't know if there's a beaver working back in there too, but there's something
Could
going on back
be,
there.
because,
Yeah.
and the city finally did get out and put some chicken wire around the rest of the remaining shade trees to try and, save some for the people.
Yeah.
So, we're willing to share some with the beaver, but not all of them.
Hey, you guys, there's another,
I
there's
saw
another
that. Yeah.
comment in the chat. Did you want to, Charlie, you can comment on that?
It says, I think many people shy away from natives because they think it's more work, especially two-income households. It might look like too much work to do with native plants in the garden. That's a good point. I mean, when we did the survey, again, that was a little hard to get at in there, but I do think that a lot of people talked about ease of maintenance and cost. Yeah, go ahead, Christine.
One of those houses it wasn't torn down on Cemetery Hill, but it was actually moved over to Hickman, and that very house had some trees around it that clogged its gutters, that set into a rotting process where the water overflowed and went up the soffit and got in the walls, and there was a lot of, it brought the house down, because the small yards and a big tree right next to next to a house with the gutters is problematic.
Yeah.
And like Birgit said about having too much work, it would be easier just to have yard and no plants at all. But I ended up actually working on that house because of the gutter situation some years ago. But I do worry about houses, the trees. A big tree shouldn't be closer than, say, 17 feet to a house, and the yards are not big enough.
Yeah.
But you want a tree, but you really, it's in conflict with the house.
Yeah, on the St. Louis part of this, so in St. Louis, I had a couple grad students that worked. So one of them did interviews with residents about vacant lots in St. Louis, and then one was looking at birds in neighborhoods with a lot of vacant lots. And one of the things that they both said, they heard a lot from residents, was about the maintenance part. Just that people said they'd like to do more stuff, but they said it was easy. It was easier to mow it, and they mentioned that probably like in a lot of cities that they were really skeptical about what the city would do. Not so much the weed owners kind of stuff, but just the city would actually maintain stuff they put in, and because I know Drew, who did a lot of the interviews, said he talked to a lot of people that said, they talked with the city about wanting to do different things, and finally just said, just mow it, because, they felt that just sort of all the things they had to go through, the maintenance issues, all these kinds of things. But they have similar to Christine with trees up there, that people talked a lot about problems with trees with some of the older houses in St. Louis, where same thing happens. They get water damage in some of the houses that have been that are vacant, and people would like to save, but they pretty much get the water damage and the trees starting to grow into the house and that kind of thing after a couple of years. So that was an issue that came up there as well. I know that Danielle Fox with the city has said that they're trying to do some training programs, and master naturalist and master gardener are trying to do this too, to work with people on giving some help in how you actually can develop native plants in your yard, and ways you can do it. So that may be one option too. Right.
And I'm also thinking that, maybe there's some kind of approach we can come up with too, in terms of a program for inexpensive seed sharing, or plant starts sharings, because it can be kind of expensive. I was just pricing like native plants at Hy-Vee actually has native plants this year, yay, in their garden center, but they cost $5 each. So you can't get a whole lot, but if people could get that might be something we would think about maybe for Earth Day festival next time we get to have one, which right now we hope will be in the fall sometime. But maybe not till next year, but maybe we could work on being able to give away seeds or it's kind of an environmental justice thing to people who can't really afford it, but if they had the materials, they would take it home and plant it in their yards. And I gather more native plantings attracts more birds and things, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I know there's been, the native plants attract more birds. And I want to say that I'm not sure on this. I know that Nadia said for the shrubs and some of the things that she's been able to get shrubs. I know they grow stuff it's either, I don't know if they're growing at Lincoln's farm, but she's been involved with getting some things for shrubs, for native shrubs. So I talked with her about that. She can get a lot of the woody stuff.
Okay.
And through Lincoln, I think somebody put Conservation Department can too. And so sometimes I think it's just getting people aware of it. And I know we did Bob Pierce, who's our extension specialist in fisheries and wildlife and natural resources, and Hank Stelzer, who's a forestry extension specialist. They have a lot of information on extension website about managing natives, working with natives, those kinds of things. And they have a lot of information about where you can get them, like Missouri Wildflower Nursery and other places. So they might be, I think they're another good resource too.
Okay.
And but I know that Nadia said they've been able to do a lot. And I assume MU Extension does, I think probably Hank might be. The other thing too, they have a pollinator stewardship program they're doing, which does a lot of stuff around pollinators, but again, it's mostly native plants. So that might be another group to check with as well.
Right, it's something that, because we always kind of struggle with what kind of things should we do for one, an environmental justice type project, and then two, just Earth Day in general. So
yeah, and I think that one, but again, I think Barbara Buffalo probably she knows a lot about she said the city was really interested, a lot of the residents were really interested in the neighborhoods and the strategic neighborhood areas, because those cover, in fact, we tried to map out how those overlap, and they overlap pretty well, with the strategic neighborhoods, and then with the areas, and that especially those areas, it's 1 and 2 are the ones which probably cover most of it on the north side of the city, and north and east sides of the city, and those are ones I think would be pretty relevant.
And I'm wondering if those neighborhoods would end up at Earth Day anyway, if many people would.
I think people show up sometimes. I think it's kind of getting the right, figuring out the right people to ask. Like, I know with the Community Garden Coalition that there's several churches are involved in that. They might be ones, again, some like what is it? Like Progressive Baptist, and then the one that Carlos Taylor used to work at MU, used to be a preacher at, as if on Blue Ridge, and they've been pretty active with the Community Garden Coalition. I think they may be ones which might be ones to work with as well.
Yeah.
Good question, Dee. All right, so we're about at the end of our time. Does anybody else have an additional question or comment? I see Jan has put in the chat space a link to the MissouriPrairie.org and their Grow Native information about, and then also to Missouri Department of Conservation, where you can order free plants and trees. So, and Wynn says, today's paper says Parks and Rec and tree keepers will give away trees on Saturday. This Saturday, I saw that. I shared it on our Facebook page. It's a drive-through pickup at Cosmo Park at 9 a.m. So if anybody wasn't aware of that and you want some trees for your property, it's happening this Saturday. All right, any more questions or comments before we wrap up?
Thank you, Charlie. That was very informative.
Thank you very much. That's good.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting. I enjoyed it. So thank you all, and have a good night.
All right, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Good
All right.
night. Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.